The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late September, cutting through the silence of Denise Williams' College Park apartment like a blade. She'd been awake for 20 minutes already, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, while she stared at the stack of unpaid bills beside her laptop. The caller ID showed an Atlanta area code she didn't recognize, and something in her gut told her to let it go to voicemail. She'd been burned before by desperate families promising, "This time will be different, and we really need your help," only to discover they wanted miracles on impossible timelines. But the phone kept ringing, insistent and somehow urgent, and finally she answered with the weary professionalism of someone who'd spent 15 years navigating other people's crises. The voice on the other end was young, maybe 20 at most, with that particular strain of desperation that comes from watching everything you've inherited slip through your fingers. He spoke quickly, stumbling over words like someone who wasn't used to asking for help, explaining that he needed a caregiver for his mother who hadn't spoken a single word in exactly 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Denise counted automatically as he talked, a habit from her speech pathology days when tracking progress meant measuring silence in precise increments. 12 other caregivers had tried and failed, he continued, each lasting anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months before giving up or being dismissed. The family's investors were demanding proof of stability within 30 days, or they'd pull $200 million in funding from the medical technology company he'd inherited when his father died in the same accident that stole his mother's voice. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here was a young man running a company that developed communication devices for stroke patients and people with ALS, unable to help his own mother find her way back to words. "She's not broken," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "At least I don't think she is, but I don't know how to reach her anymore, and the board of directors is asking questions I can't answer." There was a pause, filled with the sound of Atlanta traffic filtering through what must have been an open window. "Can you help us?" Denise had encountered selective mutism during her years working with trauma patients at Grady Hospital, that careful silence that comes not from damaged vocal cords or forgotten language, but from a mind that has chosen protection over expression, safety over the risk of being heard. She understood the difference between can't speak and won't speak, though she'd learned that most families struggled with that distinction. The desperate edge in this young man's voice told her everything she needed to know about which category his family fell into. The address he gave her was in Buckhead, one of those neighborhoods where old Georgia money mixed with new tech fortunes, where the houses sat back from Peachtree Street like sleeping giants behind perfectly manicured lawns. Denise had worked in similar homes before, places where grief wore designer clothes and trauma hid behind imported marble and fresh flower arrangements that arrived weekly whether anyone was there to appreciate them or not. She agreed to come by that afternoon, already mentally preparing herself for what she might find. The drive from College Park to Buckhead took 45 minutes in midday traffic, giving Denise time to think about what she knew and what she needed to learn. Selective mutism after trauma wasn't uncommon, but 2 years was a long time to maintain that level of protective silence. Most people either began speaking again within the first year or developed alternative communication methods that allowed them to function in their daily lives. Complete silence for 28 months suggested either severe psychological damage or an extraordinary commitment to self-protection. As her Toyota Camry climbed the gentle hills toward Buckhead, passing the familiar landmarks of Atlanta's North Side prosperity, Denise found herself wondering what kind of trauma could drive someone so deeply into silence that a dozen trained professionals couldn't find a way through. The young man hadn't provided many details about the accident, just that his father had died and his mother had withdrawn completely, but the specifics would matter. The how and where and when of trauma shaped the path back from it. The mansion materialized at the end of a curved driveway lined with Bradford pear trees, just beginning to show their autumn colors. The house was elegant in that particular southern way that suggested old money and older traditions, all white columns and red brick and windows that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Denise parked beside a black BMW that looked like it had been recently washed, noting the way the circular drive was designed to accommodate multiple cars, but currently held only 2 vehicles, as if the family had shrunk to fit their grief. The young man who answered the door moved with the careful posture of someone carrying weight that wasn't quite his to bear, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he were perpetually bracing against an invisible wind. He was taller than she'd expected from his voice, with the kind of precise haircut that suggested either personal discipline or an assistant who managed such details. "I'm Marcus," he said, extending a hand that was softer than his voice had led her to expect. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't." He led her through rooms that felt simultaneously lived in and abandoned, past furniture that was clearly expensive but somehow lifeless, as if the people who had once filled these spaces with conversation and laughter had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the echo of their presence. Family photos lined the hallway walls, but they stopped abruptly at what must have been the spring of 2 years ago, as if time itself had decided to pause and never quite figured out how to start moving again. "She sits in the garden most mornings," Marcus said, gesturing toward a set of French doors that opened onto what looked like something from a magazine about southern living. "She used to handle all the marketing for our medical device patents. Brilliant at it, actually. She could take the most technical innovation and explain it in a way that made families understand how it could change their lives." He paused, staring out at the garden. "Now she just sits." Through the glass, Denise could see her new client clearly for the first time. Helen looked to be in her early 50s, with the kind of careful beauty that suggested a lifetime of good skincare and regular salon appointments, though her hair had grown longer than fashion would typically dictate, falling past her shoulders in soft waves that caught the afternoon light. She sat at a wrought-iron table painted white, her hands folded in her lap, with the precise positioning of someone who had learned to hold very still, staring at nothing in particular with the focused intensity of someone seeing things invisible to everyone else. The silence around Helen seemed almost tangible, like a wall built brick by brick over the course of 28 months. Denise had read through the files from previous caregivers during her drive over, noting the consistent pattern of approaches that focused on the mechanics of speaking rather than the reasons for choosing silence. Speech exercises, vocal warm-ups, breathing techniques, even music therapy designed to stimulate vocalization. All of them missing the fundamental question of why someone might decide that words were too dangerous to use. "The investors meet with us in exactly 27 days. Marcus continued, running a hand through hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper stylist in months, despite its expensive cut. "They want to see what they call family stability before they release the next round of funding for expansion. Our company develops communication devices for stroke patients, people with ALS, kids with cerebral palsy, who need alternative ways to express themselves." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The irony isn't lost on anyone. If we can't help our own family communicate, how can we convince anyone we can help theirs?" Denise began to understand the full scope of the pressure this young man was carrying. This wasn't just about a mother's silence or a son's concern. This was about a business empire built on the foundation of helping people find their voices, now threatened by the very communication crisis it was designed to address. The previous caregivers had been treating the symptoms without understanding the stakes, focusing on getting Helen to speak without recognizing that her silence had become the fulcrum on which her entire family's future balanced. "I'll need to see her medical records," Denise said, watching Helen through the French doors, not just from after the accident, but from before. her baseline communication patterns, her relationships, her work style. And I'll need you to tell me about that night, about the accident itself, everything you can remember, even details that don't seem important. She turned to look at Marcus directly. Especially details that don't seem important. Marcus's shoulders seemed to drop slightly, as if someone had finally asked him to share a weight he'd been carrying alone for too long. They were coming home from a charity gala downtown, something at the Fox Theatre for Children's Cancer Research. Dad was driving because Mom had worn heels that were killing her feet, and she was already complaining about them in the car. He stopped, his voice catching slightly. She was always complaining about something small like that. Shoes or traffic or the air conditioning. It was just how she showed she cared, by worrying about details. The picture he painted was achingly familiar to Denise, the kind of ordinary family dynamic that becomes precious only in retrospect, when the opportunity to be annoyed by small concerns has been permanently removed. She waited, understanding that this story needed to be told at its own pace, that interrupting now would break something fragile that was just beginning to form. A drunk driver ran the red light at the intersection of North Avenue and Piedmont. Marcus continued. Dad died on impact. The paramedics said he probably never knew what happened, that it was instantaneous. He was staring at his hands now, as if the story were written there in lines and calluses. Mom walked away without a scratch physically, not even a bruise, but she hasn't said a word since the paramedics arrived, not to the police, not to the doctors, not to me. Nothing. Uji, if you're drawn to stories about families finding their way back to each other, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. The first week fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and strange, like learning to dance to music only one person could hear. Denise would arrive each morning at 7:30 to find Helen already in the garden, positioned at the same white wrought-iron table with a cup of coffee that had invariably gone cold while she stared at the middle distance. The coffee was always black, always in the same blue ceramic mug, always accompanied by a cloth napkin that remained untouched throughout the morning. Marcus would have left for the office by then, his BMW backing out of the circular drive with the careful precision of someone who had learned to control every variable he possibly could, in a life that had been shaped by forces completely beyond his control. He drove the same route every day, leaving at exactly 7:15 and returning between 6 and 6:30 in the evening, except on Tuesdays when he stayed late for board meetings that had become exercises in explaining why his family's private struggles shouldn't affect public confidence in their corporate mission. Denise tried the conventional approaches first, partly because she wanted to understand why they had failed, and partly because sometimes the obvious solutions worked better than anyone expected. She would sit in the chair across from Helen and talk about safe, neutral topics. The weather, which in late September Atlanta was beginning its slow transition from summer's oppressive humidity to the crisp clarity that made October the city's most beautiful month. The birds that visited the garden, particularly a pair of cardinals that seemed to have claimed the ancient oak tree as their territory. The way the morning light caught the last roses of the season, still blooming despite the shorter days. Helen's responses were minimal but present. She would occasionally glance over when Denise spoke, a quick flick of recognition that suggested awareness rather than absence. Her breathing would change subtly when certain topics came up, becoming slightly more shallow when Denise mentioned Marcus's work schedule, or slightly deeper when she commented on the garden itself. Most tellingly, Helen would turn away entirely when sounds from the house became too intrusive, particularly when Marcus spoke loudly on phone calls with investors, or when the housekeeper ran the vacuum cleaner in the adjacent rooms. But Denise was watching for different patterns than the previous caregivers had documented. She noticed how Helen's hands would move almost imperceptibly when the neighbor's dog barked, her fingers tracing small circles on the table's surface as if she were writing invisible words, how her shoulders would tense when airplanes passed overhead, which happened frequently given their proximity to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. How she would close her eyes entirely when Marcus played music in the house, but only certain kinds of music, only songs that seemed to carry emotional weight beyond their melodies. Most significantly, Denise observed that Helen wasn't absent or disconnected. She was hyper-aware, processing every sound and movement and change in her environment with the intensity of someone whose survival depended on constant vigilance. Her silence wasn't the result of withdrawal or depression, though those elements were certainly present. It was an active choice, renewed every moment of every day, a decision that required enormous mental and emotional energy to maintain. On Thursday of that first week, while Helen sat in her usual position and Denise pretended to read a magazine she'd brought from her apartment, a delivery truck rumbled up the driveway, carrying flowers from one of those expensive Buckhead florists that catered to families who could afford to have fresh arrangements replaced weekly, whether anyone was home to enjoy them or not. The driver was young and cheerful, whistling as he carried an elaborate bouquet of white lilies and baby's breath toward the front door. The kind of arrangement that spoke of sympathy or remembrance or the awkward desire to acknowledge loss without having to actually discuss it. Helen's reaction was immediate and telling. Her entire body went rigid, her hands clenching into fists so tight that Denise could see her knuckles turn white from across the table. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and for a moment her lips parted, as if she were about to speak, about to cry out or protest or simply say no to whatever those flowers represented. But then the moment passed. The delivery truck drove away, and Helen returned to her careful stillness, leaving only the echo of what might have been words hanging in the autumn air. That afternoon, Denise found what the other caregivers had missed. In the study that had belonged to Marcus's father, tucked behind medical journals and patent applications and the accumulated paperwork of running a successful technology company, she discovered an iPad that was still logged into Helen's personal accounts. The device was covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been touched since the accident, but when Denise pressed the home button, it came to life immediately, revealing a carefully organized collection of apps and files that painted a picture of who Helen had been before silence became her primary form of expression. The music library was extensive and meticulously curated, organized into playlists with names that told the story of a life lived with attention to emotional detail. Sunday mornings contained acoustic folk and gentle jazz, the kind of music designed to accompany lazy weekends and newspaper reading and the comfortable silence of long marriages. Anniversary dinner was full of standards from the 40s and 50s, songs about enduring love and shared memories and the particular romance of growing old together. Marcus' baby years featured lullabies and children's songs mixed with the kind of upbeat pop music that young mothers play while folding laundry and making dinner and negotiating the beautiful exhaustion of early parenthood. But it was the most recent playlist that made Denise's breath catch in her throat. Created just 3 days before the accident, it was titled New Beginnings and contained exactly 12 songs, each one carefully selected and arranged in what seemed like a deliberate sequence. The songs spoke of second chances and fresh starts, and the possibility that even long-established lives could be reimagined and renewed. It was the playlist of someone who had been planning for a future that would never arrive. That evening, after Marcus had returned from the office and Helen had retreated to her bedroom for the night, Denise approached him with the iPad and a theory that felt both obvious and revolutionary. They sat in the kitchen while he heated up leftovers from a dinner that had been prepared by the housekeeper and eaten mostly in silence, and she explained what she had discovered about his mother's relationship with music. She wasn't just listening to these songs, Denise said, scrolling through the playlists while Marcus ate reheated lasagna with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had forgotten that food could be about pleasure rather than just fuel. She was curating them, organizing them, creating soundtracks for different parts of her life. That's not the behavior of someone who was depressed or disconnected. That's someone who was deeply engaged with her emotional landscape. Marcus stopped eating, his fork suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth. So you think the music might help her remember how to speak? He had the hopeful expression of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust optimism, but couldn't quite stop himself from reaching for it anyway. I think, Denise said carefully, that music might help her remember why she wanted to speak in the first place. There's a difference between the mechanics of communication and the desire to communicate. Your mother's vocal cords work fine. Her brain processes language normally. What she's lost isn't the ability to make words. It's the sense that making words is safe. The next morning, Denise brought the iPad to the garden. She didn't announce her intention or ask Helen's permission, understanding that sometimes the most effective therapeutic interventions happened without warning or fanfare. She simply sat at the table, opened the music app, and began playing the first song from Sunday Mornings, a gentle acoustic piece that seemed designed to accompany the kind of peaceful domestic moments that Helen had once taken for granted. Helen's reaction was immediate and complex. Her spine straightened slightly and her hands unclenched from their usual position in her lap. Her head tilted almost imperceptibly toward the speaker, and for a moment her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the music. But there was also something that looked like pain in her expression, a tightening around her eyes that suggested the music was accessing emotional territory that had been carefully sealed off for good reason. Over the next several days, Denise began systematically exploring Helen's musical preferences, using the playlists as a map to her internal landscape. Jazz standards made her hands relax and her shoulders drop. Classical music, particularly pieces by Debussy and Chopin, made her close her eyes and breathe more deeply. But it was the playlist titled Anniversary Dinner that produced the strongest and most complicated response. When Denise played the third song, an old standard about love that endures beyond death, Helen's eyes filled with tears that she didn't wipe away, creating silver tracks down her cheeks that caught the morning sun like small rivers of grief made visible. Marcus noticed the change almost immediately. When he returned from work that Thursday evening, he found Helen still sitting in the garden, but positioned differently. Her chair turned slightly toward the house instead of away from it, her hands resting on the table rather than folded defensively in her lap. "She looks different," he told Denise as they watched Helen through the French doors. "More present somehow, like she's actually here instead of just physically occupying space." The observation was more accurate than Marcus realized. For the first time since Denise had begun working with the family, Helen seemed to be inhabiting her body rather than simply residing in it, engaged with her environment rather than floating through it like a ghost haunting her own life. The music had awakened something that had been sleeping, though whether that awakening would lead to healing or deeper pain remained to be seen. That realization led Denise to the discovery that would change everything. While exploring Helen's preserved belongings, searching for other clues to her emotional state before the accident, she found a wooden box tucked behind photo albums in the master bedroom closet. The box was clearly handmade, probably a craft project from years earlier, with "My Love Letters" painted on the lid, in Helen's careful script. Inside were dozens of notes from Helen's husband, accumulated over 23 years of marriage. Birthday cards and anniversary messages, certainly, but also the kind of random communications that develop between people who have built a life together. Notes left on bathroom mirrors and tucked into lunch bags, observations about funny things that happened during the day, reminders about dinner plans and vacation dreams, and the thousand small details that constitute the infrastructure of a shared life. The handwriting was warm and familiar, full of inside jokes and endearments, and the particular shorthand that develops between people who know each other's thoughts before they're fully formed. Reading through them felt like eavesdropping on an intimate conversation that had lasted more than 2 decades, observing the evolution of love from the passionate declarations of newlyweds to the comfortable affection of people who had learned to be themselves completely in each other's presence. But it was the final letter, dated exactly 1 week before the accident, that made Denise understand why Helen had chosen silence as her form of protection. In it, Helen's husband wrote about their upcoming 24th anniversary, about plans for a second honeymoon trip to Savannah, about how proud he was of Marcus's increasing involvement with the company and his growing maturity as both a son and a future business leader. The final paragraph, written in the same careful script as all the others, contained a promise that would haunt Helen for the rest of her life. "I know you worry about me working too much, driving too late, taking on more than I should, but I promise I'll be more careful, sweetheart. I'll delegate more responsibilities to Marcus and the other executives. I'll prioritize our time together over everything else. You worry too much about me, but I promise I'll be around to annoy you for at least another 40 years. Helen's silence suddenly made perfect and terrible sense. This wasn't just grief over losing her husband, though that grief was certainly present and profound. This was guilt over failing to prevent his death, compounded by the cruel irony that her final substantive conversation with him had been exactly about the danger she feared would take him away from her. She had tried to protect him with words, expressing her concerns about his schedule and his stress and his tendency to take on too much responsibility. When words had failed to keep him safe, she had stopped using them altogether. Armed with this understanding, Denise completely changed her approach. Instead of trying to coax Helen back into speaking, she began focusing on validating the silence, acknowledging it as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. She started leaving small notes beside Helen's coffee cup each morning, not requesting responses, but simply recognizing her presence and her pain. "The cardinals are back this morning, building a nest in the oak tree. Your roses are still blooming beautifully despite the cooler weather. Marcus made pancakes this morning. They were terrible, but he tried so hard that I ate 2 anyway. Mo." The notes were simple observations that required nothing in return, but established a different kind of communication, one that didn't demand vulnerability or risk, or the possibility of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Helen began responding to them with small gestures, a nod of acknowledgement, a slight smile when Denise mentioned something particularly absurd about Marcus's domestic attempts. Once even a hand placed briefly on Denise's arm when she wrote about missing someone who was gone. They developed a more sophisticated system over the following weeks. Denise would bring 2 cups of coffee to the garden each morning, and Helen would touch whichever one she preferred, creating a daily ritual of choice and communication that didn't require words. When Denise asked questions that could be answered with yes or no, Helen would nod or shake her head with increasing confidence. When the questions were more complex, Helen began pointing to words in the magazines and newspapers that Denise brought, creating sentences from fragments, building meaning from pieces of other people's language. The progress was subtle but unmistakable. Helen was communicating, engaging, making choices and expressing preferences and participating in the daily rhythms of life in ways that she hadn't since the accident. But Marcus was growing increasingly frustrated with what felt like elaborate workarounds rather than actual healing. The investor meeting was now less than 2 weeks away, and he couldn't understand how his mother pointing to words in better homes and gardens was going to convince a board of directors that their family was stable enough to manage $200 million in expansion funding. "She needs to speak," he told Denise during one of their weekly progress meetings, pacing the length of his father's study while she sat in the leather chair that had been positioned to face the window overlooking the garden. "I'm not asking for deep conversations or emotional breakthroughs. I just need her to say something, anything, when the investors are here. To prove that she's functional, that our family isn't falling apart, that I'm capable of managing both the company and our personal situation." The word functional hung in the air between them like an accusation. Denise realized that Marcus's trauma was different from his mother's, but just as real and just as limiting. He had lost his father and inherited a fortune on the same night, then watched his mother disappear into silence while investors and board members questioned his competence and maturity on a daily basis. He was 20 years old, trying to run a company that employed over 300 people and served thousands of patients, and he was measuring his mother's healing by its usefulness to his business survival. "Your mother is functional," Denise said quietly, watching Helen through the window as she tended to the late-blooming roses with the kind of focused attention that suggested both capability and care. "She's grieving, which is different from being broken. She's protecting herself, and probably protecting you too, in ways that you don't fully understand yet." But she could see the desperation in Marcus's eyes, the weight of responsibilities that would challenge someone twice his age and 10 times more experienced. The medical device company wasn't just a business to him. It was his father's legacy and his family's financial security, and the livelihood of hundreds of employees who had been with the company for years. If the funding fell through, all of that would be at risk, and the board would almost certainly vote to replace him with someone older and more conventional, someone without a silent mother and a family tragedy that made investors nervous about stability and long-term viability. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you would do in Marcus's situation. I read every response. That night, Denise drove home to her apartment in College Park through the familiar rhythms of Atlanta evening traffic, past the Waffle House on Flat Shoals Road, where she sometimes stopped for coffee when insomnia made sleep impossible, past the Walgreens, where she picked up prescriptions for the elderly neighbors who had become her unofficial extended family. She sat in her living room with a cup of tea and the silence of her own choosing, thinking about the different ways people used quiet as both weapon and shield. She understood Marcus's pressure, felt the weight of his impossible situation, recognized the legitimacy of his fears about losing everything his family had built. But she also understood Helen's protection, the way silence could feel like the only safe response to a world that had proved itself capable of taking away everything that mattered without warning or explanation. As a former speech pathologist, she had learned to read the difference between silence that indicated absence and silence that indicated presence, between quiet that meant emptiness and quiet that meant fullness too complex for words. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While reviewing Helen's medical records from before the accident, searching for any detail that might provide insight into her communication patterns and emotional baseline, Denise discovered something that previous caregivers had either missed or dismissed as irrelevant. Helen had been seeing a therapist for anxiety related to her husband's work schedule and travel, meeting weekly for almost 6 months before the accident to discuss her concerns about his stress levels and their impact on his health. The therapist's notes, which Helen had signed a release for during her initial evaluation after the accident, painted a picture of a woman who was remarkably articulate about her fears and frustrations. She had expressed worry about her husband's tendency to work late and drive home exhausted, about his reluctance to delegate responsibilities that could have been handled by other executives, about the way his commitment to the company sometimes came at the expense of his attention to personal safety and family time. Most significantly, the notes indicated that Helen had been planning to have a serious conversation with her husband about reducing his travel schedule and hiring additional management support, a conversation she had been rehearsing and refining for weeks before the accident. She had been preparing to advocate for his safety and their family's well-being, to use her words as tools of protection and love. When those words had failed to prevent the exact outcome she had feared, she had stopped trusting language altogether. Helen hadn't lost the ability to communicate. She had lost faith in communication as a tool for protection, as a way to influence outcomes and keep the people she loved safe from harm. Every word felt like a risk now. Every expression of need or fear or love felt like it might somehow cause the kind of damage that couldn't be undone. Her silence was protective, not just of herself but of Marcus, shielding him from her grief and her fear and her overwhelming sense of responsibility for failing to prevent his father's death. Denise realized that the breakthrough wouldn't come from getting Helen to speak for Marcus's benefit or the investors' satisfaction. It would come from creating a situation where Helen's protective instincts overrode her protective silence, where her love for her son became more powerful than her fear of expressing it. And 3 weeks into their work together, that situation presented itself in the most ordinary and unexpected way possible. Marcus was in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, moving with his usual combination of efficiency and distraction as he tried to prepare breakfast while managing a conference call about patent applications and FDA approval timelines. He had learned to multitask out of necessity, balancing his phone between his shoulder and ear while reaching for dishes and ingredients, maintaining professional conversations while navigating the domestic tasks that no one else in the household seemed quite capable of managing effectively. Denise was outside with Helen, who was doing something she had never done before. Instead of sitting in passive observation, Helen was writing, using a legal pad that Denise had started bringing to their morning sessions and a pen that she gripped with the intensity of someone rediscovering a forgotten skill. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate, forming words that seemed to surprise her, even as she created them, as if she were having a conversation with thoughts that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten they existed. The crash from inside the kitchen was sharp and immediate, the sound of glass breaking, followed by Marcus's voice, raised in pain and frustration. He had knocked a heavy pitcher from the counter while reaching for plates, and in his instinctive attempt to catch it, had sliced his palm on the broken pieces. His yelp of surprise and the clatter of the phone hitting the floor carried through the French doors, followed by a string of words that would have earned him a lecture from his mother under normal circumstances. Helen was moving before Denise even fully processed what had happened. For the first time in 2 years, she stood and walked with purpose and speed, pushing through the doors into the kitchen, where Marcus stood holding his bleeding hand, still trying to explain to confused investors why their call had been interrupted, attempting to minimize the disruption, even as blood dripped onto the white marble countertop that his mother had chosen years earlier with such care and attention to detail. "Careful," Helen said. The word emerged clear and strong, carrying all the authority and concern of a mother who had watched her child hurt himself and could not remain silent in the face of his pain. It was the first word she had spoken aloud since the paramedics had arrived at the accident scene 28 months earlier, and it contained within it all the love and fear and protective instinct that had been building pressure behind her silence for so long. Marcus stopped mid-sentence in his explanation to the investors. The phone slipped from his shoulder and landed on the counter with a plastic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet of the kitchen. He stared at his mother, who was already moving toward the sink, turning on the water with practiced efficiency, reaching for the first aid kit that lived in the drawer beside the refrigerator. Taking charge of the situation with the competence of someone who had spent 20 years caring for the people she loved. "Mom," Marcus whispered, and the word carried the weight of 2 years of silence and longing and the particular grief that comes from losing someone who is still physically present but emotionally unreachable. Helen looked at him directly for the first time since the accident, really looked at him with the kind of focused attention that acknowledged not just his physical presence, but his emotional reality, his struggles and fears, and the impossible weight he had been carrying since inheriting responsibilities that should have been shared rather than shouldered alone. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went beyond words to encompass all the ways they had failed and forgiven each other, all the ways love persists even when communication breaks down. "I'm here," Helen said, and took her son's injured hand in both of hers, examining the cut with the careful attention of someone who understood that some wounds require immediate care while others heal slowly and invisibly over time. The next 2 weeks passed in a completely different rhythm, as if the entire household had been reset to a frequency that everyone could finally hear clearly. Helen didn't become suddenly talkative, but she began using words with deliberate intention, choosing them carefully like someone handling precious objects that could be damaged by careless treatment. She would say, "Good morning," when Denise arrived each day, the greeting accompanied by eye contact that felt like a small miracle. She would ask Marcus, "How did you sleep?" over breakfast, short conversations that carried more emotional weight than the lengthy discussions they had shared before the accident. Marcus, for his part, seemed to understand intuitively that his mother's return to speech wasn't about his timeline, or the investors' expectations, or the business pressures that had dominated his life for the past 2 years. He began leaving his phone in the study during meals, creating space for conversation to develop naturally rather than competing with the constant demands of corporate communication. He started asking Helen's opinion about business decisions, not because he needed to prove her competence to outside observers, but because he remembered that she had been the marketing mind behind many of their most successful product launches. When the morning of the investor meeting arrived exactly 2 weeks after Helen's first words, she dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that she hadn't worn since before the accident, taking time with her appearance that suggested not vanity, but respect for the significance of the occasion. She sat beside Marcus at the head of the polished conference table in their midtown offices, with Denise positioned nearby in case emotional support was needed, though it became clear quickly that Helen's participation was a choice rather than an obligation. The presentation unfolded exactly as Marcus had planned, with graphs and projections and testimonials from patients whose lives had been changed by the communication devices his company developed. He spoke with confidence about market expansion and clinical trials, and the regulatory pathways that would allow their technology to reach more people who needed alternative ways to express themselves. The investors asked their expected questions about profitability and scalability and competitive advantages, the kind of business conversation that had become routine for Marcus despite his relative youth. But then Margaret Hensley, the senior partner who had been mostly quiet during the formal presentation, looked directly at Helen with the kind of focused attention that suggested this moment had been planned rather than spontaneous. "We've heard wonderful things about your background in marketing and your role in the company's early success," she said, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent decades evaluating family businesses and understanding the dynamics that made them succeed or fail. "What's your perspective on the company's future direction?" The conference room went quiet with the kind of silence that feels heavy with expectation and judgment. Everyone present knew about Helen's selective mutism, about the family's personal struggles with communication, about the questions that had been raised regarding their stability and their ability to manage the kind of expansion that $200 million in funding would make possible. This wasn't really a question about marketing strategy or business vision. It was a test of whether the family could function under pressure, whether they could present a united front when their financial future depended on it. Helen looked around the table slowly, taking in the faces of the men and women who held her family's legacy in their hands, People who would make decisions based not just on financial projections, but on their assessment of personal reliability and family stability. She glanced at Marcus, who was trying not to hold his breath, his hands folded carefully on the table to hide the small scar across his palm where he had cut himself 2 weeks earlier. She looked at Denise, who offered the slightest nod of encouragement, a reminder that words were tools rather than weapons, that speaking could be an act of love rather than risk. "Communication," Helen said slowly, her voice carrying the careful weight of someone who had learned to value each word individually, "isn't just about finding your voice. It's about knowing when to use it." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the same methodical care she had once applied to crafting marketing campaigns that could translate complex medical technology into language that desperate families could understand and trust. "This company helps people who have lost the ability to speak, but I think our real mission is helping people who have lost the desire to be heard," she continued, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each sentence, as if the act of speaking in this formal setting was helping her remember skills that had been dormant rather than destroyed. "That's a different kind of silence, and it requires a different kind of understanding. My husband built this company on the belief that everyone deserves to be heard, even when words don't come easily. Even when speaking feels dangerous or impossible, or like it might cause more harm than help." The investors listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood they were witnessing something significant, not just a business presentation, but a demonstration of the very principles that drove the company's mission. Helen's return to speech wasn't just about family stability. It was proof that their technology and approach could work even in the most challenging circumstances. "My son has carried that mission forward during a time when our own family was struggling with the complexities of communication and loss," Helen continued, looking directly at Marcus with pride that was visible to everyone in the room. "That tells me everything I need to know about his leadership, his character, and his understanding of what this company really represents. We're not just selling devices. We're offering hope to families who think they've lost each other forever." The vote to release the $200 million in funding was unanimous, decided in less than 10 minutes of private discussion after the family and Denise had left the conference room. When Margaret Hensley called Marcus that afternoon to deliver the news, her voice carried warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. "Your mother's presentation was exactly what we needed to hear," she said. "Not just the words themselves, but the evidence that your family understands the human dimension of what you're trying to accomplish." After the investors left, Helen remained in the conference room for several minutes, looking out at the Atlanta skyline through windows that offered a view of the city where she had built her adult life, where she had raised her son and lost her husband and found her way back to her own voice. The afternoon light caught the glass towers of downtown and the green spaces that made Atlanta unique among major cities, a metropolitan area that had never quite lost its connection to the natural world that surrounded it. "I wasn't ready before," Helen said finally, speaking to Marcus and Denise, but also to herself, processing emotions that had been locked away for so long they felt foreign and familiar at the same time. To talk about him, to talk about that night, to talk about anything that mattered. Words felt dangerous, like they might break something that was already broken beyond repair. Marcus moved to the chair beside her, understanding that this conversation was happening because Helen had chosen it, rather than because circumstances had forced it. "And now?" he asked, his voice carrying curiosity rather than pressure, genuine interest in her emotional state, rather than concern about its impact on business obligations. Helen smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Denise had seen from her, a smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face, making her look younger and more like the woman she had been before grief had taught her to be careful with every emotion. "Now, I think silence can be just as dangerous as words, maybe more so, because it cuts us off from the people who love us, from the possibility of being helped and comforted and understood. She reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand, the same one he had injured in the kitchen, now healed except for a thin white scar that would probably fade over time, but would always serve as a reminder of the morning when protective instinct had finally overcome protective silence. I don't want to lose any more time being afraid to speak, afraid to ask for what I need, afraid to tell you how proud I am of the man you've become and how sorry I am that you've had to become him under such difficult circumstances. The changes that followed didn't happen overnight, but they were steady and sustainable, building on the foundation of trust and understanding that had been established through months of patient work and careful attention to emotional safety. Helen began joining Marcus for breakfast regularly, then for lunch when her energy allowed it, then for occasional dinners with business partners and family friends who had been waiting patiently for her to feel ready for social interaction again. She started working part-time, consulting on marketing strategies for new product launches and patient outreach programs, bringing her expertise back to the company, but at a pace that honored her ongoing need for emotional space and processing time. Her insights were as sharp as they had ever been, perhaps sharper for having been refined by personal experience with the kind of communication challenges their products were designed to address. Marcus, meanwhile, learned to run the company with less desperation and more wisdom, understanding that sustainable leadership required delegation and boundary setting rather than the frantic control that had characterized his first 2 years as an accidental CEO. He hired Sarah Chen as Chief Operating Officer, an experienced executive who could handle day-to-day operations, while Marcus focused on long-term strategy and the vision that would guide the company's growth over the next decade. He also started setting firmer boundaries around work hours, remembering his mother's concerns about his father's schedule and his tendency to sacrifice personal time for professional obligations. Marcus began leaving the office by 6:30 most evenings, spending time in the garden with Helen, talking through business challenges and family memories with equal attention and care. Denise continued working with the family for 6 months, gradually transitioning from full-time caregiver to occasional consultant as Helen rebuilt confidence in her own voice and her ability to navigate complex emotional terrain without losing herself in silence. The progress was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small, sustainable changes that accumulated over time into something that looked remarkably like healing. Helen would speak up in meetings when she had something valuable to contribute, but she also felt free to remain quiet when she had nothing to add, understanding that silence could be a choice rather than a prison. Marcus learned to ask for help when he needed it instead of carrying every responsibility alone, recognizing that leadership meant building systems that could function even when he wasn't personally managing every detail. Most importantly, they began talking about Helen's husband and Marcus's father regularly, keeping his memory alive through words rather than hiding it behind protective silence. They shared stories about his sense of humor and his dedication to the company's mission, about the way he had balanced professional ambition with family devotion, about the lessons he had taught them that continued to guide their decisions even after his death. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost exactly 13 months after that first desperate phone call that had brought Denise into their lives, she arrived at the Buckhead house to find Helen and Marcus sitting together in the garden, sharing coffee and reading different sections of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with the comfortable rhythm of people who had learned to enjoy each other's company without constant conversation. It was such an ordinary scene that it took Denise a moment to recognize how extraordinary it was. A mother and son who had found their way back to each other not through dramatic gestures or forced breakthrough moments, but through the patient rebuilding of trust in their own voices and their ability to use those voices to maintain connection rather than create distance. Helen looked up as Denise approached, her smile immediate and genuine, no longer requiring the careful consideration that had marked her early attempts at social interaction. "Good morning," she said, and the words carried all the warmth of someone who had rediscovered that speaking could be a gift rather than a risk, an act of generosity rather than vulnerability. Marcus gestured to an empty chair that had been added to their usual garden setup, evidence that their morning routine now included space for visitors and conversation and the kind of spontaneous interaction that had been impossible during the long months of protective silence. "Join us," he said. "Mom was just telling me about her ideas for the new patient testimonial campaign. She thinks we should focus on the silence before the speech, not just the words that come after recovery." Denise poured herself coffee from the thermal carafe they had started keeping on the garden table and settled into her chair, surrounded by the sounds of Atlanta spring morning. The cardinals were singing in the oak tree, building a nest in preparation for another generation of life. The traffic on Peachtree Street hummed with its familiar rhythm, the sound of a city waking up and getting on with the business of daily existence. It was the soundtrack of life continuing, of voices finding their place in the larger conversation, of families learning that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we almost didn't say. Over the following months, Helen's return to public life became a gradual but purposeful process. She began attending company events again, not as a silent presence, but as an active participant in conversations about mission and vision and the human impact of the technology they developed. Her first public speaking engagement was at a conference for families affected by communication disorders, where she shared her story not as a tale of miraculous recovery, but as an example of how healing can look different than expected. "I want to talk today about silence," she began, standing at a podium in front of 300 people who understood firsthand the challenges of communication barriers. Not the absence of words, but the presence of protection. Sometimes silence is what we need to survive loss. Sometimes it's what we choose when words feel too dangerous to use. And sometimes, when we're ready, silence becomes the foundation for speaking with more intention and care than we ever had before. The audience responded with the kind of attention that comes from recognition rather than curiosity. People who understood that Helen's journey was relevant to their own struggles with finding and maintaining voice in a world that often seemed designed to silence the most vulnerable. Her presentation was booked solid for the next 18 months, drawing audiences who were hungry for a more nuanced understanding of trauma and communication and the possibility of healing that honored rather than erased the reality of loss. The medical device company continued to thrive under Marcus's leadership, but with a sustainability and humanity that reflected the lessons his family had learned about the relationship between personal well-being and professional success. They expanded their product line to include devices specifically designed for people with selective mutism and trauma-related communication challenges, recognizing that the market for alternative communication tools was broader and more diverse than traditional medical models had acknowledged. Helen's marketing expertise helped the company reach underserved communities and develop more accessible pricing structures, ensuring that economic barriers didn't prevent families from accessing the technology they needed. They opened a foundation in her husband's memory, providing communication devices to families who couldn't afford them, and funding research into the psychological and social factors that influenced communication recovery after trauma. The Foundation's work attracted national attention, not just for its innovative approach to assistive technology, but for its understanding of communication as a fundamentally human rather than purely medical issue. By its third anniversary, the Foundation had provided devices to over 5,000 families, trained hundreds of healthcare providers in trauma-informed communication therapy, and funded groundbreaking research into the relationship between emotional safety and vocal recovery. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Helen and Marcus understood their relationship to each other and to the legacy they were building together. Marcus learned that true leadership meant creating space for others to find their own voices rather than demanding they speak according to his timeline or expectations. Helen learned that protecting the people she loved didn't require sacrificing her own needs or voice, that love could be expressed through careful words as well as careful silence. On quiet Sunday mornings, they would sit in the same garden where Helen had spent those silent months, drinking coffee and planning their week together with the kind of easy conversation that comes from having survived something difficult and emerged stronger rather than just intact. They talked about business strategies and family memories, about missing their husband and father, about the strange gift of understanding each other more deeply after nearly losing each other completely. Helen's voice, when she used it, carried the weight of someone who had chosen each word carefully, who understood the power of both speaking and remaining silent, who had learned that communication was about connection rather than just information transfer. Marcus listened with the patience of someone who had almost lost the chance to hear his mother's voice again, who had learned that some conversations are worth waiting for, that some words carry more meaning because of the silence that preceded them. If stories about resilience and finding your voice again resonate with you, subscribe and let me know in the comments which moment felt most real to you. The medical device company's offices in Midtown Atlanta eventually displayed a simple bronze plaque in the main lobby, installed on the second anniversary of the investor meeting that had secured their future funding and validated their approach to family-centered business practices. The plaque read, "Everyone deserves to be heard, especially when words don't come easily." Below it, in smaller text, "In memory of those we've lost, in honor of those still finding their voices." Visitors often assumed the message referred to the patients who use their communication devices, and in many ways it did. But those who knew the real story understood it was about something more personal and complex, about a family who had learned that healing doesn't follow corporate timelines, that love sometimes expresses itself through silence, and that the most important conversations often happen when people finally feel safe enough to be vulnerable with each other. Years later, when business magazines wrote profiles of Marcus's success as a young CEO, they focused predictably on financial metrics and market expansion and technological innovation. But those who understood the deeper story recognized that his leadership had been forged during those quiet months when he learned to listen more carefully than he spoke, when he discovered that true stability comes not from controlling outcomes, but from adapting to change with grace and wisdom and the support of people who love you enough to tell you the truth. Helen never returned to working full-time, but her part-time consulting became legendary in marketing circles throughout the Southeast and beyond. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to understand what made people want to communicate, what barriers prevented them from sharing their stories, what messages resonated with families facing their own impossible circumstances. Her campaigns were known for their emotional intelligence and their respect for struggle, their understanding that healing happens at its own pace and can't be rushed or forced or managed like a business project. The foundation they established continued to grow and evolve, becoming a model for other medical device companies and proof that profitability and social responsibility could not only coexist, but actually strengthen each other. By its 5th anniversary, the foundation had provided communication devices to over 8,000 families, established training programs in 12 major medical centers, and funded research that was changing how healthcare providers understood the relationship between trauma and communication disorders. But perhaps the most lasting change was in how the family understood each other and the legacy they were building together. Marcus learned that leadership meant creating space for others to find their own voices rather than demanding they perform according to external expectations. Helen learned that protecting the people she loved didn't require hiding her own needs or fears, that vulnerability could be a form of strength rather than weakness. And Denise, who stayed connected to the family long after her official caregiving role had ended, learned that some of the most profound healing happens not in therapy sessions or medical facilities, but in ordinary moments when people choose connection over safety. When they decide that love is worth the risk of being misunderstood or rejected or hurt again. On the third anniversary of that morning when Helen first spoke, the three of them gathered in the garden that had been the site of so much silence and so much breakthrough. The oak tree was fuller now, providing shade for additional seating that accommodated the steady stream of visitors who came to learn about their approach to trauma-informed care and family-centered business practices. Helen looked around at the space that had been her refuge and had become a gathering place for other families facing communication challenges, for researchers studying innovative approaches to selective mutism, for business leaders trying to understand how personal healing and professional success could support rather than compete with each other. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she said to Marcus and Denise, her voice carrying the comfortable authority of someone who had learned to speak with intention rather than obligation. "I think about all the words I didn't say during those 2 years, and I used to feel guilty about them, like I was wasting time or hurting people by staying quiet. But now I think maybe I was saving them up. Maybe some words are worth waiting for. Maybe silence can be as valuable as speech when it's chosen rather than imposed." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The words they shared now carried more weight because they had learned to value them, to choose them carefully, to recognize that communication was as much about timing and safety as it was about vocabulary and volume. "The investors still ask about family stability sometimes," he said with a smile that suggested the question no longer caused him anxiety. "I tell them we're the most stable family I know. We just define stability differently than most people expect." Denise laughed, remembering that first desperate phone call when Marcus had sounded so convinced that his mother was broken rather than protecting herself, when he had measured healing by its usefulness to business timelines rather than its authenticity to human experience. "I think you've both learned something that takes most families much longer to figure out," she said. "That loving someone means accepting their way of coping, even when it doesn't look like what you expected. And that sometimes the strongest families are the ones who've learned how to be fragile together." As the afternoon light shifted through the oak leaves, casting moving shadows across the table where 3 coffee cups sat among scattered business papers and family photos, Helen felt something she hadn't experienced since before the accident. Not the absence of grief, which would always be part of her emotional landscape, but a sense of completeness that didn't require pretending the loss hadn't happened. Her husband was still gone, would always be gone, but the family that remained had learned how to honor that loss, while still building something new and sustainable and full of its own particular kind of love.